Welcome to another episode of The Aligned Life, The Goddess Life, where we dive into living life fully aligned, mind, body, and spirit, at peace and unbothered. Welcome to another episode of Trauma Thursdays. We are back with Ashley after she survived the hurricane. Welcome back to the table.
It is so good to be here. It has been a wild few weeks.
Mother Nature decided to take a massive hard left into forceful nature. So it happens.
Yeah, I mean, all in all, it wasn't bad. It disconnected me from the internet, but it reconnected me with my community immediately around me too. So it was an interesting dynamic. I've got a lot that I want to explore in my own personal channels around like reflections post hurricane and a lot of the things that I kind of realized and saw as I was moving through it.
Oh, I can imagine. And our topic theme of the day is diving into the self and diving into those things. And I'm sure some things will kind of click and pop up in there too. So feel free to throw them in if any of them do like resonate with these ideas. Um, but also as like a big personal win for trauma and for people. I do want to take a second and talk about what happened at the Miss Kansas pageant in the last couple of days, where Alexis Smith, the now crowned Miss Kansas, was open and vulnerable and sharing her healing with the audience while she was on stage.
That was absolutely like wonderful to watch because I feel like if we don't talk about it, then it's easier to shove it under the rug. And, I've noticed in the last few years, it's not just in the civilian world, for lack of a better term, but like I've seen a lot of shifts within the military too. And the military is always the last place to change if you didn't know. Um, but really starting to break down those barriers and be open and talk about abuse and really starting to bring that awareness so that people that didn't know that they were abused can actually like see it for what it was, and then that then opens up a healing opportunity for them, right?
Oh, 100%. I was explaining it to my husband the other day. We were talking about something in the almost identical vein and how important it is to speak about what has happened. He brought up a really good point. He found it really odd that when we talk about other types of medicine or health, no one is like hush hush or like shy about it. You broke your leg. Oh my goodness. Everybody wants to send you their well wishes. They want to bring you comfort. They want to help you in your healing journey, support all of these things. But if it's your brain, if it is something happening emotionally, we shouldn't talk about it. And when we think about it in that aspect, it doesn't really make sense.
One thing I've noticed is that if your pain is your injury, let me rephrase that. If your injury is invisible, whether it's some kind of chronic inflammatory disease, right? Such as like autoimmune deficiencies, or it's um, different neurological diseases, traumatic brain injuries, whatever it is, if there is not a physical displayed symptom, the people's tendency is to just make the assumption that you're fine without realizing what's going on internally, whether it's emotional, mental, or it's actually physical. Like if we don't see an example outwardly, we just make the assumption that they're perfectly fine.
Oh, yes. Yes. There was a TikTok that I saw a while back, and it was of a woman in a wheelchair. And she was in a bathroom and she was waiting for the handicap stall. And the whole purpose of her video was that we need to be accepting of the needs of other people. Um, through having this understanding through self, through being able to step into that higher self and be more objective and allow for people to navigate the world in their own ways, just as we are in our own ways. Because other people were going in line in front of her, taking this handicap stall, and people were like, that person was not in a wheelchair, this is clearly your stall. And she's like, we have no idea what's going on with that person. That person may have back problems, they may have other internal issues, they may have weight needs that only this handicap stall can accommodate. And we are not the ones who can judge that. They're the ones who can judge that.
Absolutely. Like as a disabled veteran, I've had two hip surgeries. So I have good days and I have bad days. And there's a lot of stigma that vets will face, especially if you don't have that visible signifier, right? One of my friends, he has a prosthetic leg, and people treat him so differently when they see the prosthetic versus it just having his pants down, right? And you can't visibly tell. So they'll see him hop out of a handicap spot and try to, advocate for disabilities, but like they don't even know what they're advocating for or who they're advocating for because he clearly has a disability, you know, but they can't physically see it. And then the moment they realize it, they're like, oh, and then they feel all this shame. But like if we just trust that people are doing what they need to do, and have a more compassionate perspective instead of taking the assumption that people are always selfish and out for themselves and these seemingly able-bodied people are just being selfish and taking the handicap spots, and just step back and be like, maybe there's a reason for it that I just can't see. I think that if we just took that approach in all aspects of life, it would be so much better, especially because of the emotional wounds that we're facing and, aren't able to fully like see within others.
Oh, absolutely. That it allows us to start one building those different neural pathways, which we have talked before about, which builds new perspectives. Again, diving into that idea of the self, but it also allows us to start building the world to be more accepting and understanding of accommodating those who may be struggling in different ways. And again, going back to Miss Kansas, you know, she in the clip that we saw, for those of you who have not seen it, who are listening, you can find it on TikTok. And she clearly states that there were people who very obviously noticed her having a really rough time at the very beginning of this particular event because she saw her abuser in the audience. And that rattled her. And she made a point of saying, well, this is not normal. This is going to be different, but I am not going to allow this to take over my life negatively right now because I'm going to be Miss Kansas. And she did. She did just that. She stood up there and she faced that and made it something that now I feel like is going to open the doors for us to be more comfortable in normative conversation about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I love that she decided to make a stand for ending domestic violence too, because it's
Yes.
something that is just it like, okay, so maybe it's generational, but what was acceptable within relationships 20, 40 years ago, right? And even further back versus what's acceptable now is so different. And you have that trickle down effect where each generation's importing certain values and certain normative behaviors into their children. So it's a very slow progression, of people adapting and recognizing that's not okay. That is totally not okay. And being able to have that inner authority to stand up and say, like, no, this isn't okay. And I'm not going to take it. I'm not going to tolerate it. And you shouldn't enable it. But until it's brought up into the mainstream conversation and people really start to share their stories, like we saw with the Me Too movement, it's still going to be very hush hush and taboo. And we don't talk about that. Right.
Oh yeah. And I feel like that also kind of goes in line with understanding and having the ability, the resources to understand what it is you're feeling, what it is you're going through, having those safe spaces. Um, I won't use any names for this, but this is relevant. I recently had a friend reach out to me who they found themselves caught up in a situation that they were not 100% educated about or understanding of. And they had a little bit of a miscommunication on this intimate activity, we'll call it. And in this intimate activity, more was going on than she was really comfortable with, but she did not feel like she was necessarily being taken advantage of. It was more like this is not what she expected, and it immediately made her feel uncomfortable. And because it made her feel uncomfortable, she was having a really, really hard time like coming to terms with what had happened and understanding these things. And this is something we see especially in domestic violence a lot, in DV cases a lot. Because a lot of times people feel like they have to go with the wishes of others because they've made a decision to be in a relationship. They have to go with the decision of others because that other may be a parental figure or another support figure, or they feel like they have to go through these conversations and they have to go through these difficult DV situations because they have made a choice. Um, Now in the idea of self-exploration and doing this, and she quickly realized that this was not for her. She still ended up like doing more than she wanted to, but she learned that there is this other aspect of her, these other feelings of her that she wasn't really paying attention to. And that opened the doorway for her to address those. So just talking a little bit on that self-exploration point of it, understanding what it is you want, what your voice is, helps us in those DV situations or those complex relationships or encounters where we may feel trapped.
I think one of the big themes that I see within that, though, is, tiptoeing over the line, right? Where
Yes.
you pushed it just a little bit, and then, oh well, you did this, or this was okay, so why is this a big deal? And it keeps getting rationalized and justified, whether by the alleged abuser or it's by the person experiencing that abuse. And it just keeps, in essence, like nudging the can down the road until all of a sudden you've looked back and you've gone like 5 miles beyond where you were comfortable. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not to say that it's bad to push your comfort zone, but within a safe space. And when I'm interacting with a lot of clients and just people in my day to day, most people don't know what their needs are. So we react with anger and sadness and shock and all of these things when our safety needs are violated, but we've never actually stopped to ask ourselves, what did I need in this situation that would have made me feel safe and comfortable in exploring something new?
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like that's also why people get really stuck in and not to like put a blame on anything because also as a person who survived aspects of DV, um it it is part of what causes people to get stuck in that cycle. of not being able to get out because that brings up so much guilt and it makes us feel like we were part of that problem.
Yeah, that and there's like this weird investment dynamic, right? Well, I mean, I've already invested so much time into this relationship. Like, I don't want to throw it all away. And you see that a lot in marriages or long-term relationships too.
Yes.
Um, this hesitancy to walk away instead of um really just like owning where you're at. And so one of the things that I really, really, really nail on is with clients that have faced deviant abuse is normalizing, creating toleration points and red lines, right? And being able to communicate those, which is like hand in hand with boundaries, but they're really separate because it's hard to know in the moment when you're experiencing it where you are drawing the line. This is as much as I'm tolerating, right? And
Yes.
when that line has been crossed, your red lines. And having that in a very practical, tangible way can be so helpful when you're navigating these relationships and dynamics. And like, normalize a safe word if you have to, right? If you have a healthy partnership, like come up with a word that you give each other whenever you're like getting to that point where things are getting a little uncomfortable, right? And we're approaching that line. And then whenever you cross that line, so that way you can actually have a discussion about it, what's going on, what you're interpreting, and what the actual intentions are of the other person.
Yes. Diving into the exploration of feelings and identifying our feelings, um, it's a process because we come from a society that is inherently reactionary. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there is a lot of disconnect between learning how to pull yourself out of that reactionary state and putting yourself into those healthy mind frames. And I think the safe word is a really magnificent idea. I don't think I've heard of anything like that before. We typically hear about the walking away and, taking some time to breathe and reduce those cortisol levels. That way you can come back with different words and different phrases that you can use to translate what's going on inside of you. But I really like that safe word because it's almost like a trigger of, okay, now we have to step out of emotion and into that higher self,
Yeah.
and we have to have a discussion.
So I have a client that is experiencing issues with her teenage daughter, right? And they both have gone through a ton of trauma, and they're slowly trying to, the mom's working on herself, right? So that she doesn't accidentally traumatize the daughter more. But the daughter triggers her. So it's this weird dynamic. And as they're trying to rebuild this relationship, one of the things that I had suggested sitting down with the daughter's therapist and then her and I is creating like a code word list. Like facilities, they'll have like a code red or code blue, right? And you already have a system set up. This is how we respond when this emergency code is given, right? And like if you need time out and you need to walk away, like code red, right? And you immediately disengage, and that person holds the responsibility of coming back whenever they are feeling safe and regrounded, and they're more normalized and able to have that conversation. Whereas like a code blue might be, okay, we need to immediately stop taking this personal and swap perspectives or something like that, and creating these types of communication guidelines so that when it's engaged, you already know what's expected and what to do in order to navigate that in a healthier way. And I really, really loved that. And it kind of was born from this idea of creating a safe word for them. But there's so many different dynamics that they have to navigate that having that like code word type plan, emergency action plan, was absolutely necessary.
I also liked how you mentioned there that that person is responsible for coming back. to that conversation later, because it not only makes it a safe space for one, but for both. Um, and although that is always the intention of like that idea of joint family group therapy, when it comes to dealing with the relationships themselves, it often can go very one-sided. And I like that that code system very drastically shows, hey, we're going to come up with this together. We're going to work through this as a like root together, and responsibility is still held. I think that's very powerful.
Absolutely. And if you're looking at building out one of those within your relationships, whether it's parent child or it's partnerships, making sure that you're really looking at what each person needs in order to feel safe. And you were talking about the reactivity. Reactivity is
Yes.
not inherently bad. It's just when it's repetitive reactivity and we're not actually getting closure from those those situations, right? So it's
Yes.
important for us when we're in a reactive state, after we have calmed down, to come back to it and be like, okay, what specifically was it that triggered me? And what did I need that moment to feel safe, to feel like I could express myself and belong? What are those things that I need that were not present in that moment? And how can I start to incorporate those and communicate those with those around me in my circle so that
Yes.
I can come from a space of responding? And if we don't seek that closure and reflect on those experiences, right, and talk through them, whether it's with ourselves or others, you're going to be stuck in that reactive loop.
Oh, absolutely. Um, and this is another point where diving into that self can come in, because then there's also a point of accountability when we're looking at these aspects in relationships. Well, what if the person is not, what's the best way to phrase this? Let's take the scenario or the situation of a person who is not going to necessarily cut off the person who is disrespecting boundaries,
Okay.
but the person's obviously not going to respect those boundaries.
Okay. So, in other words, that person's not receptive towards what you're communicating, but you're unwilling to cut them off.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, that really comes down to those red lines and toleration points, because especially if you're unwilling to cut them off, you really need to get down and dirty and really, really, really clear as to where you are going to continue to tolerate, because that is a really dangerous situation where you can continue to kick that can and you're going all the way around the world, hun. Right? Like
Oh
you
yeah.
you let it go so much. There has to be consequences. But one of the things that I really loved, I heard a therapist say on like a reel or something, was, boundaries aren't about them changing their behavior. It's about you telling them what behavior you're going to change if this is not honored. Right? So if you're not
Yes.
willing to cut them off, you might put yourself in timeout, right? And disengage from that relationship for a month, depending on what that dynamic is, right? And why you're unwilling to cut them off. But I mean, honestly, like I ended up having to really cut off my mom for a few years before we were able to come back and really reconnect and build a healthier relationship. Because when I was
Yes.
giving feedback, it was not being received. And it took that action, that extreme action of me absolutely going no contact and completely disengaging before she was willing to look at it and be like, okay, maybe there's something to explore here. And it gave me the space and distance to reflect and realize that, a lot of those narcissistic presenting tendencies weren't actually intentionally harmful. It was just the way that she was brought up and raised, to relate to one another. It was the best way that she knew how. But in that space, before going no contact, it really felt like she was just completely dismissing me and trying to one up me. And it was just a really unhealthy thing. So, I
Yes.
mean, don't, if you need to go no contact, go no contact. That doesn't mean forever. It
Yes.
can be repaired as long as both parties are willing to come to the table and really communicate through those challenges and learn to honor each other's needs and come from that compassionate space where you're able to kind of look at that other person's perspective. Because understanding what it was like for my mom growing up and how she learned to, express love and care for others was really, really helpful for me to not take things so personally, right? And interpret it in such a harmful way.
Yes. I think that there is definitely more stigma than not in the social media communities for when you go no contact to remain no contact. Not that it's necessarily like geared that way, but we don't often talk about coming back after. We
Absolutely.
hear so much about people who have cut off relationships and they're like, well, we've been no contact for like 3 years, or I've been no contact for like 6 months. Um, your goal does not have to be total separation forever.
There's situations where that is absolutely necessary, but I mean,
Yes.
the goal is to step away from that dynamic so that you can reflect, right? And
Yes.
then come from a place of responding instead of reacting, right? And one of the things that I'm always talking to clients about is you can't just opt out of a karmic pattern by just saying no, right? You have to actually
Correct.
grow and move through it. So, like, especially when it comes to relationships, a lot of my clients will try to go, well, I'm just not going to date anymore. I'm just gonna go and be a hermit, and I'm never gonna date again. But then you're losing that opportunity to learn from those old experiences and figure out, where might I have been enabling this? Where should I have maybe have put down a boundary? Where was I tolerating too much? Where was I not being truthful to myself and honoring myself and my needs? And then learning how to communicate that and navigate it, and learning how to opt out of relationships whenever those things aren't being honored. you know
Yes.
you can't so when we go no contact forever and we just consistently burn bridges, what happens is we inadvertently burn a bridge while simultaneously building a bridge back in the same direction, right?
Yes.
So you have different people in a line on one island, right? And you've crossed the bridge, you burned it down, and then you go down the line and build a bridge right back to that same type of person, that same type of situation. And you repeat it and you burn that bridge. And so you're just in that loop constantly, and not able to actually like have a different experience.
Yes. I like that analogy of the islands and the bridges. I'm heavily guided to, we your island should be more of your island instead of you traversing to the other islands. We should be importing and exporting with the other
Yes.
islands. We should have bridges for communication and contact. Um, but very much in the ideas of like therapy and understanding this idea of self and our feelings and the different types of controls and boundaries we have access to, that is us building up our own islands and
Absolutely.
making them so nice. Like you have a wonderful resort on your island. And there's a beautiful like water park. And then that way, if you need to cut off a bridge, if you need to, blow it up, get it out of the way, you're not being stuck going through the other bridges. You're going through and you're still working on building up all of those resources that you have and understanding just which islands are no longer meant to have this connection for whatever needs or means. You can still import export without a bridge. There's boats.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think um kind of going along those lines of building up your island is really recognizing what resources you have that you're willing to share, right? And that's where boundaries come down to play, right? Whether it's mental, emotional, it's energy, it's time, it's physical or material goods, it's sexual intimacy, right? Those are all our resources, and really taking stock of those resources, and knowing where we're comfortable sharing and at what level of intimacy we're level what level of intimacy we are comfortable sharing those resources, in it with those different groups, right? Because you have the strangers, you have the acquaintances, you have friends, you have the close friends, people that are family or like family, and then you have your partnerships, right? And a lot of the misconceptions I see around boundaries is it's one thing that applies to everything, right? And those could absolutely be like safety need boundaries, but if a stranger's knocking on my front door, I'm not opening the door and inviting them into my house, and sitting down and having a conversation with them in the living room. I'm stepping outside the front door, and I'm going to maybe speak to them then, unless they're a solicitor, then I have no interest,
Right.
but whereas if one of my friends comes over, whether it's announced or not, right, I might invite them into the living room, but that doesn't mean that they have free the freedom to just kind of like help themselves into the kitchen, and wander off and start looking through my office or one of the bedrooms. And I really like drawing that analogy of the house and how you would greet them and what access they would have, and relating it to those levels of intimacy when it comes to boundaries, because that's a really easy, tangible way to see it in action and see where your comfort is with that person, to really figure out what your resources might be that you're willing to share.
Oh, I like that idea. Because it is, there's so many different avenues and aspects of human connection. Um, and I feel like that kind of feeds into a different what's the best way to say this? It when we don't recognize those levels of relationship, those levels of connection, those different types of boundaries, we often find ourselves, and this also goes with kind of repeating those same mistakes. I'm trying to think of like like the kindest way to put this, the gentlest way to put this. Um, because some of this trauma, when we get into these traumatic cycles and we get into these different aspects of relationships, these cycles at some point begin to happen because we're not making those changes. They're almost self-inflicted.
Absolutely. It's refusing to really reflect and recognize those enabling behaviors, which then in turn is what consistently enables and creates more trauma, more pain, right? And
Yes.
one of the big things that I'm about, coming from my own background of trauma, is this recognizing my responsibilities. What was my role in that situation? Because that gives me my power back, right? It gives me something that I can tangibly take action on and implement and change in order to stop experiencing those situations over and over again. That's not to say that everything is my fault, or I asked for this, but honoring places where I didn't speak up, where I didn't walk away, where I didn't honor that gut feeling within me.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
putting myself into unsafe situations and not, recognizing that I was not comfortable and that I needed to leave. So little things like that we can change, and it puts us back in power, and it allows us to really honor who we are and what we need, so that we aren't consistently replaying that trauma over and over and over again. And I think that that's really where it comes down to that closure, and something that we really, really lack as we're learning how to like break all of these cycles in this new age.
Oh, 100%. I'm also reminded of my own personal trauma, especially, putting myself in dangerous situations. Um, not being reflective is such a heavy hit. And this is not only to say that there is some personal responsibility in some of the decisions also. Um, it's more so to say that there are different ways that you can still show up for yourself by utilizing these different methods that we've gone over to find where your responsibility is and how you can change that. Um, one of my clients that I'm working with is having an issue where they're a little reliant on one of the people who's responsible for some of their traumatic situations. And this
Mhm.
reliance needs to remain. And so we're currently going through how to deal with the emotions that come out, identifying them and putting them towards this person, this situation, and trying to figure out how to navigate those internally. Because again, we can't cut off, we can't. This is a family, a close family member. So the boundaries are a little harder to determine, but when we can show up for ourselves and put that responsibility in ourselves, and you start to become angry because of what this person has or has not done, we can then take that and evaluate. And we can kind of look through and be like, okay, so is it worth it for me to hold on to this anger? Or is it more beneficial to my healing and my state to release that anger and to work through this situation still, even as if maybe I had cut this person off?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm always talking about emotions being an inner compass. So anger specifically, you're looking at either a values violation or a safety violation, right? There's some
Yes.
unmet need and it's something that we're passionate about. And that's where passion and anger go hand in hand, right? Because it's very much the way which perspective you're taking and which way you're looking at it, but it always boils into either it's covering up something, because anger is only the safe emotion to feel in some families like mine, right? And you can't feel sad, so you're angry. But usually anger is a passionate response. It says, this is really important to me and I don't feel like it's being honored. So a values violation, or I don't feel safe. And we're reacting in that fight response. And whenever we're in an amygdala hijack, right? And it's preparing us to defend ourselves. So it's always going to be down to safety or values whenever we're angry. And being able to really look at that and own what specifically it is that's causing that, so that you can then take that opportunity to communicate it, can really change that dynamic of that relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, even if it is, I also want to say that there is so much value in if it is still met with friction, there's still value in it, in you expressing it.
Absolutely. And people are slow to change.
Yeah.
So when you're setting those boundaries, when you're communicating, it's unrealistic to expect someone to commit that to memory immediately. I mean, think of how many times someone's like told you that not to do something because it's annoying and you default to doing it. It's going to take a bit of reminding to have them be able to adjust their own internal neurology, right? So it's going to take some consistency and practice. And if that person is receptive, they're going to be actively trying to identify it. And it might be in hindsight at first, just as if we're trying to form a new habit or behavior, we're going to notice it in hindsight after the fact and be like, oh, dang it, I did it again. Right. But as we continue to prioritize that awareness and prioritize that change, then we'll start to catch it closer and closer. Next thing you know, you catch yourself right before you do it or in the act of doing it. Like, oh, I'm doing it now,
Yes.
right? And then we start to to have that awareness and see as it's coming up and are able to shift and adjust.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, if you're going through something similar to this, and let's say just covering all aspects as I see them come in. And let's say this other person, you have done it multiple times, they still don't seem to be changing, but you're still not really at a point or a place or a want to cut off. You can still create boundaries for yourself. You can say, I'm not going to have these types of conversations with you. I'm not going to do these types of activities with you. There are other smaller, let's call them micro cutoffs that we can do where we're like, okay, I'm not going to allow this to come into my space because this is where I can exert my control in the situation because you don't have to. And if that means that you have to leave your situation and come back later at a time where it won't be brought up or addressed and you have made your point known, then you can do that too. Um, there's so much that is within our own control when we're doing these things that as we become reflective and more self-aware, we can take advantage of.
Absolutely. It's like setting the parameters, right, of that
Yes.
interaction. So like going back to that house analogy, right? Like if they've got a key to your house, you take it back or you change the locks if they won't give it back, right? And then whenever they come over, instead of allowing them into the house, maybe you step out the front door and have the conversation, you know?
Yes.
But like knowing where you are not going to tolerate things is absolutely critical. And then honoring that for yourself and opting out, right? But if you're not really clear and honest with yourself about your safety needs and your values and all of that, then you're not going to know where your toleration stands and where your red lines are. And it's just going to kind of keep pushing that boundary. It's just going to be very, very malleable and um next thing you know, it's well beyond that, and it's really, really hard to. It's easier to hold the line in place than it is to push back and put the line back where it needs to be.
Exactly.
You know,
Yes.
um, and so if you're letting it give too much, it's going to be much, much, much harder to get it back to where it needs to be. And then again, you're having to, to reteach that person what is acceptable around you. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of my clients struggle with is the people in their circles have to then relearn what's acceptable. So like when it comes to self-love and honoring yourself and knowing yourself, it's immediately setting the tone of what is acceptable around me and what to expect from me, right? So that it doesn't get so far beyond that it almost feels like trying to climb a mountain with nothing but the clothes on your back in order to get this boundary back to where it needs to be.
Yes, it can be very overwhelming, and tiring. And I feel like a lot of people get really turned off of not only that personal work, but also turned off of the idea of finding a solution with someone that they're having this relationship problem with because it can be that strenuous. Um, which is also why, and we've talked about this before, I find it so important that at the beginning of your healing journey, stepping back into your power and falling back in love with yourself are like the two main portions. Because what that does is it sets you up for understanding your own worth in your own eyes. And it sets you up with this idea of, okay, well, I'm not going to give up on this because I am deserving of the happiness, of the peaceful outcome, and of not being hurt any longer.
Absolutely. And I know we've done a few episodes on self-love, but I think that it's something that definitely needs to be explored in huge depth because it seems so intangible. if you've never really felt worthy or valued or enough, that is such a confusing concept. It took me so long before I really understood what was meant by self-love. And having like those tangible things has really, really helped me anchor in that idea and understand how I treat myself is how I allow others to treat me, and knowing what my boundaries are, where my values are, what my needs are. How do I talk to myself? you know, um, and things like that, because it just, I don't know, self love, you see a lot of mainstream media kind of capitalize on the doing, right? It's, oh, go treat yourself and have a spa day, go buy yourself this pretty shiny crystal, you know, take a bath, right? And it's so much more than that. It's
Yes.
about, it's really honoring what's okay for you and not allowing people to treat you any differently.
Yes, yes. And yeah, we we seem to touch on self-love all of the time, but like you said, it's so large.
Mm-hmm.
And it literally ties into everything because when we fall into these cycles, let's look at this idea of big air quotation self-inflicted trauma. Let's be real here, friends. When we start getting into that cycle of the self-inflicted trauma, we are so far removed, and I speak from personal experience, we are so far removed from ourselves and our personal being during those times that we are simply trying not to drown. And
Absolutely.
when that happens, we end up finding dangerous things. We end up not understanding. We fall into that trap of, well, why is it always me?
So I actually touch on this in one of the blogs I'm about to release because I'm behind because of the hurricane. But like, I literally like was thinking to myself as I was driving down the road one day, like it just hit me. I was like, I hurt my own feelings most of the time. Like, I'm so busy rejecting myself that I haven't even given other people the opportunity to accept me and show that they accept me, especially within dating relationships, right? Like, the moment that there is an opportunity for me to mind read and pretend like I know what somebody's thoughts or intentions are, I will immediately start to tell myself the story about how I am not good enough and how they don't really care. And I will literally start to push myself away and disengage from that relationship because I'm so busy rejecting myself that I don't give them the opportunity to show me any different.
Oh,
And
yes.
as an empath, especially because I became emotionally unavailable because I could feel everybody's emotions and start personalizing it and taking it personal, right? It's all about me. And it's suddenly my fault or I'm doing this, right? And it's how empaths tend to negatively cope with navigating all of those weird feelings, right? But I have to remind myself, Ashley, you are an emotion reader, not a mind reader. You might pick up on those feelings, but you don't know why they're there.
Exactly. There is typically this is one of my favorite things. I know I've said this till I'm blue in the face, but the four agreements and not taking things personally actively changes my life on a daily basis. Um and it's because of my anxiety, it's because of my internal self-talk, because very similarly, like I will sit here and talk myself into a corner
Mm-hmm.
and then
Or
I can't get out of it.
or we tell ourselves stories about somebody's intentions and what they think about us, right? And gosh, let me tell you, I would tell myself stories all the time. Like I was basically creating multiple fictional stories about my reality instead of living in my reality. I was living in those fictional worlds that I was creating, right? And it
Yes.
messes with your perception. And
Hmm.
then that also screws with your boundaries and your ability to uphold those boundaries because you're just telling yourself all these stories and taking everything so personally
Yep.
when it's not about you half the time, right? And that was me being unintentionally toxic. Hello, I will admit it. Like I was traumatizing myself with all of these freaking stories about how I'm not good enough and consistently reaffirming that. And that was part
Yes.
of my own discovery about self-love was recognizing those stories and the storyline. So one of the big things I make my clients do is I have them write out their life story. And then I have them rephrase it and reframe it so that it's in a much more positive aspect. I find all those places where they're like mind reading and assuming somebody else's intentions, and we immediately line that out, you know?
Oh, I love that. That's a great idea. And when it comes to that idea of self-inflicted trauma, because it is, you're traumatizing yourself. And a lot of times this does stem from like the idea of like attachment styles and things like that, because we get stuck in attachment styles, I feel like not only literally stuck in them themselves, but we get stuck in the idea of them a lot, because we can be actively working on being secure, big air quotes there. We can be actively working on being secure, actively in these secure relationships, and there will still be anxiety that pops up. We're still going to have triggers. We're still going to have these moments that pop up. And it's what you do with it. Again, that internal, that self exploration, and where you're holding yourself responsible and accountable that makes that particular change. Um, and so I love that you have found a way for not only yourself, but also your clients, for them to see where something may be, oh, you kind of did that to yourself there.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one of the big things that I'm always telling my clients is, flip the mirror. It's not about them, it's about you. What stories are you telling yourself? How are you taking responsibility? What are those emotions that you're feeling? What are they trying to tell you and guide you towards doing, right? Because if we get stuck in the they, um, then we're missing how it's impacting us and what it's trying to teach us. If we can reflect and learn from that situation to figure out where we might need to adjust, then that gives us our power back and gives us the ability to stop re-experiencing that situation, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm drawn to this idea of how like therapy is about healing the self, so we can be more successful and open in our social environments.
Absolutely. But I mean, I think the whole purpose of life is to explore different aspects of ourselves that we may or may not be aware of, and also expand those aspects of self, right?
Yes. Oh yes, absolutely. Because that is it's getting to know yourself. It is, in order for us to find fulfillment. And this is just my own perspective. This is not uh, said anywhere else or in the thoughts of any, I mean, it could be, but this is my own thought. That before we pass from this plane, as we're going through this idea of consciousness, this evolutionary life, because we're constantly evolving, we're constantly changing, being in tune with that process, being in tune with who we are and that collective idea of consciousness, being able to reach and attune that, for me, is what seemingly is a huge part of this purpose. And you cannot do that. You cannot do any of that without diving into the self and learning all of this stuff about you. So I agree fully with that. I would love for other people to like send us an email with what they feel like the purpose of the self journey or the conscious journey is, because I would love to see what the psychology behind that does. So if anybody wants to, feel free to do that.
Right. I mean, I've always looked at it as like everything's this giant sphere, right? A ball, if you will. And like the 2 points where you can see everything is either the innermost center point or the outermost point, right? Which is why religions either take the perspective of going up or going in. And from there, you have the vantage point of the whole sphere and the awareness of the whole sphere.
Yeah, I like that. I've never thought of it as a sphere. I've always seen it more as like a map, but I like the idea of it as a sphere. That's a
Yeah. Well, I mean, I usually like talk about the different dimensions within that sphere as like layers, kind of like the earth, right? And it's different layers of like the core and then the magma and all of that and the layers of dirt. So it's like these little layers of dimensions and awareness, right? And so as you're going out, you're able to touch like say the 10th dimension and see things from that perspective and have the awareness of that sphere. But if you're only aware of like the third dimension, you only have this little awareness of this tiny little ball, right?
right.
So that's why I like to look at it as a big old giant ball.
Oh, I love
That
that.
it kind of illustrates the interconnection of everything, right?
Yes. Well, and we talked about that, I think in one of our round tables, the spiral
Hmm.
of the conscious connection. So it makes sense. A ball, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Um, I love that. I love that. Well, I'm
And
going
then
to
you
go
have all
ahead
the
and
little atoms inside of it that are like excited and are bumping into each other and slamming into each other and sometimes knock you out of your dimension.
yes.
Hence the spiritual experiences as a result of trauma or near death experiences. You get hit so hard, knocks your little atom all the way up to the 10th dimension before you come back.
Oh my goodness. That I keep seeing that scene from like Men in Black with the aliens playing with the marbles and the marbles are the galaxies.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Like that is yes, that is exactly what it is in my brain now. I love that. I'm sending our link just so you know, I'm sending our link to Lane now so she
Okay.
can hop in and we can start on the round table. So much has been going on with all of this hurricane that you went through.
I know.
What kind of self dive did you do during the
Oh my.
hurricane?
Okay. So a big thing was all about like accepting help and support, right? Was one of my big things. But then also there was because I'm in a relationship now. So it's navigating that and learning to be okay with them not being okay and not needing to fix
Yes.
it has been a huge point for me. And it's really uncomfortable. And I've noticed the tendency to want to like crack a joke and cheer them up or explore it more. And I'm just like practicing just letting them deal with it and not having to help them deal with it. Right.
It's so weird. Having to work on that. That is also where I'm at in my healing journey is I'm having to understand that one, it's not always my fault, which this is probably going to take years for me to like I've already been working on it for years. It's going to take me many more years to actually pull myself out of it's your fault.
Like
But I'm
literally, this
working
is
there.
like my whole July blog series is about the emotional unavailability of empaths and HSPs because we're able to like sense and pick up on these things. And then the way that we end up learning as children when we don't have that full understanding is trying to give ourselves the illusion of control to fix it because it's uncomfortable, right? And we don't fully understand it is we then either internalize or externalize it,
Yes.
right? And this is like things that I'm actively writing about. So I just finished that blog. Yeah, what was that? Yesterday, the day before. And then I have one other where I'm talking about like creating those energetic boundaries. Um, and like shielding, but with intention and not taking things so personally and all of that.
That has been
Um,
another hot topic recently is shielding.
yeah,
And I've talked about like I've talked about the egg meditation probably 8 times in the last 3 days.
yeah, like as an empath, it or highly sensitive right now, like things are insane and uncomfortable, and like learning not only one, it's not your fault, stop taking it personally, but two, like set boundaries around what you know. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Like you don't need to like walk through a crowd and be in touch with every single like 100,000 people's emotions.
Oh,
Like if it
exactly.
doesn't impact you or relate directly to you, get out of the energy.
Yeah. Yeah. Stop pulling in more than you should. This is a big part of self-respect. When you respect yourself, you're not going to allow yourself to be invaded by things that I want to use the words don't concern you, but I know that that may be a trigger point for some people. It's more so that you are not part of that problem, nor are you part of that solution. You haven't been invited.
So, like listening to you, the saying that came into my head was, "You're not a water treatment plant.
Yes,
Like it's not your
absolutely.
responsibility to filter all of that water."
Yeah, it's not. And you are only giving more of yourself than you need to when you become that treatment plant.
Yeah, because like I was talking about sponges, but like some people really like they get so enmeshed, they pull all of that in and like take on that responsibility of transmuting all of that energy. You're not a water treatment plant, man. Don't do that to yourself. That's a lot of work. And even water treatment plants have thousands of people and staff and lots of equipment to be able to do what they do, you know?
Yes. And they're under like 24/7 watch because at any point, one small thing could go wrong and cause the need for something to be fixed. So, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not here to do that. That's not what
Not only
our
that,
purpose is.
I remember being on Kandahar Airfield right next to the water treatment plant, and they have a whole pond of poo, and it smells awful. They had probably four ponds. So, I mean, do you really want to live like that? Because I can tell
Right.
you it was not fun.
Yeah, that is not comfortable at all. So yeah, that just more reasons why you should love yourself and respect yourself and set not only your emotional boundaries, but your metaphysical boundaries and your physical boundaries. Boundaries are
Mhm.
important all over. Um but yes, thank you for talking about this with me today. And